So I want to get right back to discussing this and seeing if I can make any progress on the issue that I was trying to outline. So although it might be controversial, I still want to stand by that sort of general depiction of Stoicism as being its laser focus of constraining the purview of the logos to a kind of architecture and structure of how morality is deployed. And so the Logos doesn't ever sort of get into touching elements of factual claims themselves, but only deals with the principles that are meant to sort of process those things. Um, and the problem is that having a kind of strict division like that is actually fundamentally unsustainable. It can be that unsustainability can be concealed in such a way, um, so long as one remains locked within a kind of a historical context or a cultural context or some kind of greater default narrative, you know, somewhat the cart that is leading the dog around. um, it gets horribly that general condition, which is the linchpin that allows the kind of the stoical um, schema to not ever confront its kind of inherent incoherency or sort of its own internal tensions or failings, um, is that it has to disguise every avenue of freedom. It has to sort of dispose of that quietly. That has to sort of melt away in some sense. And it's almost the adversity which Stoicism is not capable of confronting is the adversity of real liberty, of real freedom. And so, inasmuch as that you cannot just put everything into the dichotomy of control in between what is up to you and what is not up to you, perhaps there is something that is up to you that has to do with actually choosing what is up to you and what is not up to you. And that second layer of meta stoicism, in some sense, which stoicism itself is sort of forever incapable of developing within itself, um, uh, sort of consigns it to being fundamentally non-comprehensive. And the only way it can kind of avoid that is by just sort of everything is just a mere worry of everything is a kind of a reactive affront that has to be judiciously engaged with. But when it's not a kind of a point of adjudication, when it's a point of liberty, then it sort of it comes unstuck. And so the point is that every opportunity, therefore, for liberty has to be fudged into some greater narrative of adversity or some narrative that secures the sort of the steady stream of uninterrupted adversity, which Stoicism then can merely fluidly react to and never have to sort of worry about its own internal nature, um, so that it can sort of avoid having to develop what would then become a poisonous meta stoicism, which would seek to sort of uproot the kind of the purity of the kind of that is essentially the stoical treasure, um, that one is merely a kind of a vessel of immediate purity of concern, that one is not sort of mixing one's logos into some um, decadent I just made other descriptions in the last recording that sort of pertain to um, anyway. And so, to use other broader words, although I do want to get into the issue of fudging, because I do think that this is the fundamental problem of Stoicism, and I've described it in a very sort of precarious way, but it does have more manifestations. And so I'm using fudging in a technical sense to mean that Stoicism itself, I've already tried to describe it as generally a method, not a full philosophical kind of schema, although uh, I think I've tried to make the argument that it's not comprehensive. And in some sense, therefore, it doesn't really have the kind of uh, uh, in its treatment of the logos, it does not create an independent enough basis upon which comprehensively all matters can be dealt with. As I've said, the kind of adversity that it is not capable of coping with is the adversity of a kind of a creative endeavor. It doesn't have a resource of inspiration. It has an endless resource of having a kind of clarity in its kind of reactive efficiency and efficacy, so it has this idea that it's maximizing efficacy on this moral, within this particular moral schema, but that moral schema doesn't have a comprehensive purview. um, and another way of describing that is that it's not independent of some process that it is already sort of involved with, and sort of so it's sort of it's naturally um, entracted into, so there's this element in which it presumes or assumes a kind of intracted state of being, which is symbolized by the cart being leading the dog around on a leash. And then I do think that my analogy is very pertinent, that effectively it can't deal with the fact that sometimes the leash gets detached from the cart, and it can choose to reattach to a different cart, that it can sort of choose between differing carts. And that fundamental sort of uh, choice is something that is beyond Stoicism, um, because it doesn't have something like a faith from which to have that idea of what to do when you're unleashed from the cart. What is the independent notion? You have to already be entracted into something. In which case, it knows how to maximize its relationship to the speed of the cart and the conditions that the cart is producing. Um, so yeah, now I want to talk about the fudging aspect. So and you can sort of already you can use one's own imagination to imagine how, if everything has to fit that, the cart analogy, you could call that somewhat a meta narrative, and because life has to effectively be forced and constrained into supplying that narrative in terms of at least analogously what is going on from a moral perspective, from a metaphysical perspective, or a philosophical interpretation, at least with regard to morality. Um, Again, yeah, I do think that does the logos, therefore, paradoxically or ironically, ends up being contorted in a radical way, because because it is forced to playing a reactive role and to sort of govern the reactive sort of, it's able to keep its powder dry. It's able to sort of energize and keep one's mind governed by a very simplistic way of assessing things, so to ward off confusions and hypothetical, you know, deluge, and so one can sort of stay immediately devoting one's focus onto maximizing some immediate, engagement with life. There's a form of purity in that. Um, but there's also a what's the point that I was going to make here now? Is that paradoxically, what then is being fudged is exactly on that meta narrative perspective, is that the logos, it, I guess it's two different things. It's like, in some sense, I do agree that there's a definitely a kind of fortitude that the Stoic is manifesting in saying, I am actually capable of understanding that that the conditions of my life are like a cart that I am leashed to, and having the kind of the fortitude in order to conceptualize the matter in that way, that I am going to be a master to some set of features and factors and such, and not sort of create my own delusional carts of disparate, sort of tracks that are going in different directions, that I'm actually creating a coherent vessel of a single point of engagement so that I can have an immediate point of contact, and therefore I can be grounded and centered in myself and not sort of have this pervasive sense of almost abstract, disembodied interaction with things. Um, so in that way, the as a philosophical method, it is a very embodied way of dealing with one's own concerns, um, uh, or one's I can't think of a better word, but one's matters. But then there is a but then there is uh, a strange mystical interpretation that is read into the logos itself, um, whereby you tapping the logos and sort of harnessing it in this very sort of mechanical way in which it has no connection to anything mythical in some sense, or mystical, or because it doesn't ever touch the narrative, it only touches the principle, that then paradoxically or ironically, it is almost regarded as being a mystical materia in its own, as its own sort of platform, as its own sort of piece of the puzzle that everyone is connected there through in some sense. And so it becomes a kind of a strange kind of religious mysticism in some sense. And so by not having a patent faith, it almost creates an implicit faith around itself, um, which, I mean, to do with the analogy, has the idea in something like, well, we all only have one leash, There might be different carts of different, um, things, and we might, be somewhat different in our capacities as the stoic dogs being carted around on leashes. But we all have one leash in some sense. And And I want to say that perhaps I don't even disagree with that particular interpretation, but I think that the leash itself is much more dynamic. With it, what it does, I think, overlook is the idea to which that the leash itself is not a the leash itself is this is a bit complicated to say or something like that, but that the leash itself is a composite element that is created by the cart that it is attached to and the dog that it is attached to, the life and the particular capacity or talent or whatever you want to call it, whatever characteristics and virtues the stoic dog has within it. And both of those things are not fixed, and that there is an element of liberty which, when accessed, or it's not necessary that that liberty is just a kind of is on tap. It's not just always available to the same extent that it might. I've often described it as that it is something that that all human beings are capable of, but not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily ever manifest in any particular person's life, although it is capable of being sort of discovered. So it at least exists as a capacity. Anyway, okay, that's a very complicated sort of tangent, but yeah. So the idea that all of these things, all of these elements, are also contingent on other broader or greater metaphysical features that also have to be tracked. But yeah, and I think that all of that greater search is sort of just somewhat stamped out by the Stoic sort of mind frame, which just it goes no further than the logos, or at least in its treatment of the logos itself gets to this weird sort of precipice where it's sort of that is the edge of human sort of understanding. And although it has sort of constrained itself so as not to engage in any sort of indulgences, it at the same time forces itself to live out a meta narrative that it itself, I don't think, ever can actually live up to, that it ends up having to fudge its own method and construct something like a meta narrative, which ends up becoming a very sort of groping kind of mythos in the end. Now, I think I could have described this whole fudging thing probably a bit more precisely as well, but and I will try to probably at some point, even in this recording, take another crack at it. But yeah, in some sense, I think it has to do with constraining the logos for good and for ill in such a way as to create a kind of, the Stoical formula is fundamentally a kind of reactive formula. And in the end, it ends up creating a meta Stoicism that is so formulaic in order to disguise that from itself. It ends up taking up a kind of self inconsistent view about it, in that it is that everything is fundamentally a kind of from a narrative perspective, everything is fundamentally a reaction. The only thing that the logos can offer is a reactive response to a singular cart, and that there is nothing more than a singular cart that might go on a very winding journey, but there is no opportunity to sort of to construct a new cart, or to sort of I guess within its own narrative, it perhaps has the sense that if one has a particular, you see, this is where I think it's not capable of overcoming itself, is that I think a Stoic would not be able to deny the fact that if one is more wise about one's own use of virtue, one is capable of, throughout the journey, almost subduing the cart. The dog is actually capable of conquering the cart through a very particular kind of ingenious, kind of synthesis of virtue, could eventually train the cart to be the slave of the stoical dog in some sense. And this really kind of this is what would be something like governing these matters, these metaphysics, from a kind of from a faith-based doctrinal sort of mastery of these issues, that is would be very connected with the logos, but not just treating it in such a formulaic sort of dispensation, although it would have other sort of structures and things like that. Okay, anyway, let me not get into these side issues too much. That if the dog, through the relationship with the cart, being leashed to it, is capable of, in the end, or at least in the medium term or longer term, having a kind of an impact on the nature of the cart itself, and a kind of is able to sort of change the character of the cart by accumulating and tracking a residue that it is capable of sort of precipitating in the cart, or that kind of control, the Stoic would only regard that as, let's say, a kind of a long-term cleverness or craftiness that's capable of effectively lessering adversity. And in fact, if you lessen adversity, it's not necessarily, you haven't won anything in the Stoic. You haven't necessarily. In fact, you might have even lessened the opportunity of virtue, in some sense, which maybe only really matters if you care about people's lives as being a kind of a beacon of propaganda for the promotion of virtue ethics. But if there is an independent sense of proactive purpose, again, when I say independent, I mean something that can be done about this potential power that the Stoic dog has over the cart, that can mount a control, or a sort of a way of changing the nature of the cart. I guess that element is just completely sort of, that's fudged out of the narrative in some sense. The method itself is not sensitive to that power, and it's not, it's just it's meaningless. But I think that, and in some essence, that meaninglessness is displaced by a meaningfulness that is sort of, becomes a kind of metaphysical drug in some sense, that sort of expands the notion of the logos as being a kind of a collective effort that is being sort of accumulated in some abstract disembodied sense. And so I do think that there's almost a metaphysical, I want to call it suppression, which also comes or waste as well. But and that suppression is probably linked to the feature of creativity, in that virtue is only exposed by its response um, to a procession of matters and issues that are already uh, that the individual is already sort of entracted by. Yeah, and so there's this whole in between space, which effectively I think has to sort of get translated into a kind of a pristine logos, which becomes sort of in its out of reach seclusion. There's probably a saying that or an idiom that sort of describes that. Um, yeah, I guess in some sense the motion of the cart itself is a precondition that the Stoic requires. And it is also another precondition or presumption is that the logos is effectively is built into that motion, is sort of is commensurate with that motion, and that there's something about the logos that is somewhat already embedded in all motion, and that there's a kind of there's a metaphysical sort of correspondence. I've also talked about a similar issue in which thought itself, especially by scientifically minded people that are obsessed with, kind of materialism or physicalism or determinism or all those sorts of things, and presuming those features about reality. Uh, a more sort of metaphysical way of describing those kinds of prejudices and bias is in the sort of the presumption that there's something about thought that which is, and this point is somewhat ironic or even paradoxical to the actual beliefs that these people espouse, is that there's actually something fundamentally commensurate about thought and the source code of the universe, that there is a kind of that there is there's a rational basis of clockwork symmetry uh, that because it produces order in the mind, um, it is the same feature that that is promulgating the appearance of order in uh, in so-called reality. Um, yeah, it's hard to talk about these matters off the cuff because there's so many conventional ways of interpreting these issues and thinking about these matters, and they're also laden with poisonous, sort of conventional thinking and strange prejudices. Um, I'm a form of phenomenologist myself, and I have a very sophisticated understanding of how consciousness relates to the concept of time, which I believe that those issues are actually the major source of confusion. That it is actually the mistreatment of the notion and conceptualization of time that produces the presumptions of determinism. But that is completely a separate point. I didn't really get into this fudging as much as I wanted to. I mean, I didn't really prove the point, but I did perhaps produce some illustrations of how I see it functioning. That the fudging is also, I mean, perhaps I should have constrained myself into just making much more simple claims um, in terms of the errors of this thinking, rather than making these elaborate illustrations about how they are implying other things which also happen to be self-contradictory. Um, but yeah, it's interesting that yeah, I was just trying to, I guess, make another case for this, is that the idea that because the logos is confined into sort of being commensurate with the thing that governs the motion of the cart, and therefore the motion of the leash attached to the stoical dog should try to find a way to be compatible with the motion of the cart. Therefore, it has to sort of come to its own um, connection with the logos, so as to be in harmony in some sense, to some maximized degree. Um, has within it this built-in idea that the motion of the cart being imbued with this sort of as a kind of as the prime agent of the logos, or the prime manifestation of logos in the world, or in at least the philosophical sort of mind space, or something like that, or confining the logos to that to me seems like an article of some kind of article of faith. The problem is that it's fundamentally arbitrary and assumed. Um, I believe in some sense one needs to identify with oneself as being like a stoical dog, and having a leash that does have to take on the character of some kind of logos, but not merely saying, well, it should be in the image of the cart's movement. I think the idea to identify the logos with the movement of a particular cart is a choice, is a free choice. And that also has an expanded array of opportunity and possibility that creates a more dynamic sense of, or of a more comprehensive metaphysical uh, uh, position, which is much better described by Vasti Rut's taking on nihilism and her development of the thought on that. I think that is yeah. So I mean, I've really been discussing this really as a kind of preamble, just to show the potential integration between thinking or some thought around these the issue of stoicism, and how it is just much better. Uh, you know, how these matters are much much more comprehensively handled from her from Professor Vasti Root's moral schema. Okay, well, that I guess is everything that I have to say about it. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I just wanted. Yeah, I did want to get into further elaboration as to the kind of prejudices that this form of thinking manifests. Because the idea that there's this sort of default collective logos, which is a kind of um, almost like a default collective narrative that everyone is having this sort of like joint. Yeah, I guess the idea is that there is everyone has one cart, and there is a singular matrix that is determining the motions of these carts, which is something like the logos, which means that in some, at least in an indirect way, we're all plugged into the same logos. Therefore, um, our route to being plugged into it means that we all should sort of conduct ourselves according to the particular cart, and that we should, sort of group ourselves perhaps as well by the degree to which we are associated with our respective carts and such, and there's an ordering property to that, which is also, commensurate with some of the slogans, stay in your lane and such. um not I'm just trying to think of a better way to sort of capture, um to pin this notion down. It's because, in some sense, the logos is being manhandled in such a way as to make it, in the name of it not being poisoned with a mythical kind of label, it is at the same time having a mythos being smuggled, um, in that kind of, in its sort of, in its purity kind of, so yeah, in the same way that it is, everything to everyone and the answer to everything for everyone. uh, it also has this weird kind of, well, in this particular cart scenario, um, it is in favor of there's one solution, there's one answer, there's one rational sort of, one person is right and one person is wrong. There's no scope of that there are other tracks, there are other carts, and so because of the kind of the brittleness and the rigidness within the that this is the cart, there is no sort of ulterior mode. The logos therefore endorses a single partisan position on that matter, and there is no argument for the appropriateness, or at least in at least the hypothetical, there is no argument. There is one correct sort of thing. And even in my alternative schema, there is it's a different kind of argument, or there's a different kind of persuasion that is happening, and it's a lot more. It really does not have to do with right and wrong, morally right or wrong, or moral authority is not the engine. What becomes the engine is something like the coordination of the other people involved, and levels of um, capacity and tapping and making those things accessible. And so there is a different kind of moral calculation that has nothing to do with the past. It has to do with the possibilities on the ground, which are all in some sense uh, constrained by people's mental ability to allow for things, to sort of to promulgate their own reality in some sense, and the freedom that they allow themselves to do that or not. And so you can get to the point at which the cart itself is merely just the vehicle to a wide open nexus of possibility. The only constraint really being the constraint on one's own sense of contract, of one's ability to contract with others. Anyway, that's a mouthful. But anyway, I don't think I can go on further.